We're about to start. We're on a tight schedule. Our official start for the session as a whole, which is going to be in the buildings just about 200 yards that away. We will have a proper introduction and talk about the topic and so forth. But some years ago, when Ernest May, one of America's leading diplomatic historians, was a member of the group, and we were doing a topic, Ernest gave us a talk before we got started, which sort of put in perspective the topic that we were going to deal with. That was so useful and valuable to have this historical perspective that the next year we asked Ernest to do it again. I think he did 3 of these Ernest May lectures, and alas, we've lost Ernest. But we kept the tradition, and we have found that by starting with a breakfast in which we have one of our members who can give us a little historical perspective, it sets us off much better when we get to the policy issues that we're to be dealing with. Previous lectures in the Ernest May series include Bob Blackwell sitting here in front, who told us what was going to happen in Afghanistan, among other things. So we've had a number of these. I should say that nobody could be better than the person we have this morning to start us off on Russia. Strobe Talbott, if you don't know who Strobe Talbott is, there's another room upstairs with a breakfast somewhere on something else. But Strobe, I mean, besides being Deputy Secretary of State and head of Brookings and author of a dozen or more books and so forth, one of the things that makes him particularly qualified for this job this morning is not merely that he's been thinking and working with Russia for so many years, but he was sort of a boy genius when he was at Yale. And when it came time to do the Khrushchev memoirs, here was this young Yaley doing Khrushchev memoirs. So he started off fast out of the track. But in any case, he has developed a reputation for one of the most thoughtful people we have in the country on American foreign policy generally, but in particularly understanding Russia. So Strobe, welcome to the Ernest May Memorial Lecture.
Thank you very much, Joe. And it's obviously a challenge, but also an honor to follow in the footsteps of other members of the group who have taken on this assignment. I remember particularly well Ernie May's lecture, which I think was 8 years ago, giving us some historical background on the U.S.-China relationship. And I think perhaps it is even more appropriate to have a little bit of a look back when talking about U.S.-Russian relations, given the fact that that's what Russia's leadership is doing. It's looking back and trying to come up with a path into the future. I know that Joe and Brent and Nick spent a lot of time trying to come up with a good, snappy tagline. Nick consulted with me on that a couple times. I came up with some real duds. But the one that they came up with is, I think, perfect. And it's redux. Pardon my Latin, but I think it comes from the verb reducere, which means lead backwards. And that, I think, captures in a nutshell not only what's going on, but the feature of what's going on that I want to spend at least half of the time we have this morning talking about before we get into a discussion. Basically, what I see the Russian leadership now doing is got 2 aspects to it, both backwards. One is to negate and reverse the reforms of the recent past, which is to say the late 1980s and the 1990s, while reinstating key attributes of the preceding old regime and using those attributes to be the defining features of what I would call, with a deliberate oxymoron, an atavistic new regime. And that, I think, is the essence of this word and concept, Putinism. As best I can tell, like a number of other snappy phrases that have come into our political and geopolitical lexicon, this one goes back to Bill Safire. And he coined it late in the year 2000, only 9 months into the first term of Putin's presidency, which was rather prescient, I think, on Bill's part. But my main point that I'm going to spend some time on now is that the content of Putinism, the worldview of Putinism, the motivation, the rationale, the constituencies for Putinism predate Putin's own appearance on the scene by quite a long stretch of time. Those roots go back to nearly 30 years ago, when Putin himself was a mid-level KGB officer attached to the Second Chief Directorate stationed in Dresden, where his job, let's remember, was not espionage, but counter-espionage. That is, identifying and thwarting and punishing and defeating the enemies of the Soviet state. And I think it's significant that at the time he had that assignment, back in Moscow, there were powerful individuals who came to see the last president of the USSR, namely the last president of the state in question, Mikhail Gorbachev, as himself an enemy of that state. So in looking back to the Gorbachev moment, the twilight of the Soviet era, I think it's a good time to invoke Ernie May again and his technique of thinking in time. That is, by recalling what Gorbachev wanted to do and what he thought he was doing when he was in the Kremlin. And as I look out across the group, I can see any number of people, certainly Condi and Bob Blackwell and Bob Zellick and others, who were trying to make sense of that at the time, and I think they understood very well what Gorbachev was trying to do. He had ascended to the highest office in the Soviet Union with what he believed was an obligation to save that country and that state. He believed that the status quo was holding the USSR back, preventing it from competing and prospering in a globalizing world. His supporters often used an expression that has a kind of deceptively modest ring to it in describing what they hoped their country would become, namely a normal modern state. But in fact, normalization and modernization required what was really a breathtakingly radical break with Gorbachev's predecessors from Lenin to Chernenko. Let's just take the language of reform. The vocabulary of Gorbachev's program was tellingly made up of 2 Russian words and 2 words that were borrowed straight from the English. The 2 Russian words were glasnost and perestroika, which virtually became English words after a while. And the other 2 were demokratizatsiya and partnerstvo with the West. And those were not just descriptors of administration policy out of the Kremlin. They were antonyms of the watchwords of what had been the Soviet internal regime and also the Soviet worldview. And as such, they were anathema to some of Gorbachev's supposed comrades. So let's go to June 1991. His own prime minister, Valentin Pavlov, mobilized an effort in the parliament to weaken Gorbachev's powers, no doubt as a prelude to throwing him out. And the approximate incitement for this attempt at what became known as the constitutional coup was a plan known as the Grand Bargain that Gorbachev's advisor, Grigory Yavlinsky, and our colleague, Graham Allison, had proposed as a way of garnering Western economic aid in support of perestroika. It's worth noting that Lieutenant Colonel Putin's ultimate boss in the KGB, Vladimir Khrushchev, was active in this cabal. Khrushchev and Pavlov saw the Grand Bargain as, I quote from the time, a conspiracy to sell out the motherland to foreign interests. Senior officers in the Soviet military and the security forces had their own version of that complaint. They were infuriated by Gorbachev's willingness to compromise, largely on American terms, in arms control negotiations. On the CFE talks, the zero option for the intermediate nuclear forces in Europe, globally, INF, and most stunningly, in Reykjavik, Ronald Reagan's proposal to eliminate all nuclear weapons. In short, basically bend to the American side on the core issues that led to the creation of the Aspen Strategy Group 30 years ago, and that have kept quite a few of us busy for decades afterwards. Now, the so-called constitutional coup against Gorbachev failed in June of 1991, but its instigators did not give up. 2 months later, the fear that Gorbachev was selling out to the West grew stronger, leading Khrushchev and the KGB to attempt a real coup, one that pretty much ruined Brent Scowcroft's vacation, not to mention his bosses at Kennebunkport in August 1991. But even more, it put a real damper on Gorbachev's summer holiday in Crimea. But the putsch also backfired spectacularly. It accelerated not just the terminal decline of the Soviet system, but the terminal weakening of the centripetal forces that had, for all those decades, kept the Soviet Union itself intact. So that brings us to the Terminator, Boris Yeltsin. He was Gorbachev's protege, but he was a protege that turned into a rival. He was a Soviet functionary and Communist Party member who ultimately converted into an anti-Soviet, anti-communist revolutionary. Yeltsin was the antithesis of Pavlov and Khrushchev. He was impatient with Gorbachev for proceeding too slowly and too timidly with perestroika, glasnost, and demokratizatsiya. In other words, Yeltsin out-Gorbacheved Gorbachev as a reformer, which made him popular with the growing number of citizens of the USSR who were fed up with the system. But by the same token, it also meant that Yeltsin out-Gorbacheved Gorbachev as a threat to the old guard. And partly for that reason, Gorbachev saw Yeltsin as a political liability to himself as he tried to manage the increasingly fraught dynamics of the leadership, and therefore expelled Yeltsin from the Politburo. Yeltsin's reply can be boiled down as follows. You can't fire me, I quit. He resigned from the Communist Party, but he didn't stop there. He set about being the moving force in liquidating the USSR and assuming the leadership of its largest successor state. Now, the dissolution of the Soviet Union was the last thing that Gorbachev wanted to see. And therefore, it was very much the wedge issue that Yeltsin used to replace Gorbachev in the Kremlin and to take down the hammer and sickle flag over the Kremlin and run up the Russian tricolor. But on most other important issues, the transition from Gorbachev to Yeltsin was, in its essence and in its overall direction, almost seamless. Those issues included how Russia should govern itself and how it should behave beyond its own borders. For Yeltsin, that meant, in the first instance, deciding where Russia's borders were. The decision that he made was crucial to what happened in the years that followed, and also quite crucial to what didn't happen. The inter-republic borders of the old USSR became the international borders of the Commonwealth of Independent States. There would be no redrawing of the political map to align with the ethnographic one. Yeltsin's insistence on that point further riled his already very, very tough relationships with the enemies that he inherited from Gorbachev. For them, the bloody flag grievance was not just the loss of territory, not just the loss of the system, but the stranding, as they saw it, of 25 million ethnic Russians in what were now 14 neighboring states. A common phrase that was mumbled and growled and sometimes screamed was the mutilation of Mother Russia, leaving her orphans outside the care of Moscow. Much as Pavlov had turned against Gorbachev, Yeltsin's own vice president, Alexander Rutskoy, turned against him. A number of people in the room, I'm pretty sure Bob Legvold saw this, had a chance to visit Rutskoy in his office in Moscow, where he had a huge map, not of the Commonwealth of Independent States, but of the USSR. And he would tell visitors, that's the past, but it's also the future. We'll get it back. In other words, redux. The first step, Rutskoy often said, would be the recovery of Crimea. The second would be the recovery of Transnistria. Now, this aggressive nostalgia gathered force and really rattled Yeltsin's own team. And I'm sure all of you remember, at least reading about it in the newspapers, a speech that Andrei Kozyrev gave in Stockholm in December 1992, which was just around about the first anniversary of the birth of post-Soviet Russia. And it really shook up the audience, because what Kozyrev did was to impersonate whoever might succeed him as foreign minister if Yeltsin were to be overthrown. And he played it for real and very, very convincingly, pretending to enunciate a new set of policies, two in particular. Number one, Russia's traditional and fated orientation was toward Asia and not toward Europe. And number two, Russia reserved the right to use military force to compel other former Soviet republics, particularly Ukraine, to join a new federation with its capital in Moscow. Only at the end of Kozyrev's speech did he say that he was just kidding, and it was a ruse to get the world's attention to a real danger. The following year, October '93, a critical mass of Yeltsin's opponents, whose views and intentions Kozyrev had pretty well captured, exploded into violent rebellion. Rutskoy and others converted the White House into an armed camp, dispatched gangs, well-armed, around the city, fired rocket-propelled grenades into the central television station. Yeltsin responded with lethal force and crushed the uprising. Yet 2 months later, Yeltsin's enemies struck again. This time by taking advantage of a Gorbachev reform that Yeltsin had benefited from and solidified, which is democratization. Russia held its first post-Soviet parliamentary election, and it produced a big win for Vladimir Zhirinovsky's ultranationalists, with a very strong showing by Gennady Zyuganov's communists. The platform of their so-called National Patriotic Bloc included the obligation to defend the rights of Russians in the near abroad. On the campaign trails, Zhirinovsky vowed to regain Russia's lost lands, not just in the CIS, but in Turkey, Finland, and I'm not making this up, Alaska. The point being, irredentism was, throughout the 1990s, at the core of anti-Yeltsin opposition. Yeltsin's pushback against that opposition, his refusal to countenance irredentism, his affirmation of the inter-republic borders, made possible a relatively amicable and orderly self-dismemberment of the USSR. It also facilitated the creation of the Partnership for Peace, as well as other institutional arrangements that were meant to bring CIS members, notably including Russia, plus the Baltic states, into an inclusive, integrated, pan-European, and to some degree a pan-Eurasian security structure. Now, we have to remind ourselves occasionally, or at least some of our fellow countrymen, and we certainly need to remind the Russians that this development was not a Western aspiration or demand that was imposed on the CIS. It was an aspiration of the post-Soviet leaders themselves, and the West was responding to their hopes and wishes. Now, since Ernie May had a cautious respect for counterfactuals, let me pose one here. Had it not been for Yeltsin's decision with regard to the border issue, there would have been an irredentist free-for-all in the post-Soviet space that would have been beyond horrible. And just as an accompanying piece of counterfactual bad news, it would have been impossible to persuade Ukraine to turn over its Soviet-era nuclear arsenal to Russia, especially if Yeltsin's opponents had succeeded in their demand that Ukraine turn over Crimea as well. And of course, the nightmare that we could all imagine was being played out in the Balkans at just that time. And the dissolution, the violent dissolution of Yugoslavia was an ongoing reminder of the fate that the USSR had avoided. That was the good news, and it was very good news indeed. But there was also some bad news, and that is that Russia's and Yeltsin's relations with the West were stressed, I would say, close to the breaking point by the mayhem in the Balkans, and in particular during the Kosovo phase of that conflict in 1999. And that was for multiple reasons. NATO had gone to war against Serbia and had gone to war, period, for the first time in its existence, and in doing so, of course, disregarded Russia's opposition in the United Nations. The alliance's principal target was the capital of a nation with a Slavic Orthodox majority, and therefore with strong historical and cultural and religious ties to Russia. Finally, the operation's beneficiaries were Muslim secessionists inside Serbia. That led many Russians at the time to analogize Kosovo to Chechnya. They felt that they were impotent bystanders watching a preview of what NATO would someday do to dismember Russia itself. And on top of that, at the height of the crisis, Yeltsin was in decline, physically and politically, and already pondering his own retirement. So put all that together, it's something of a miracle that despite the flack that Yeltsin was taking at home, he helped bring the war to an end on NATO's terms. He did so by investing Viktor Chernomyrdin with plenipotentiary powers to convince Slobodan Milosevic that Russia was not going to save Milosevic from a NATO invasion. Chernomyrdin also agreed that Russian forces would participate under NATO command in an international peacekeeping force in Kosovo. And that was a vital condition to assure unity of command. However, from the other side of the looking glass, the Russian military saw it as yet another galling, humiliating capitulation to the West. Some of the top brass in Moscow held out against the arrangement throughout the many weeks of negotiation, including when decisions had already been made at the top of the political structure. Their agent within Chernomyrdin's team, and I use the term very, very loosely, was a three-star general named Leonid Ivashov. He insisted that the Russian peacekeeping force in Kosovo must be independent of NATO and have responsibility for its own sector, which would have become a haven for die-hard Serbs under Russian protection who could then destabilize the rest of Kosovo and create conditions for Russia and NATO themselves perhaps to come into conflict. Chernomyrdin repeatedly, in the presence of his American interlocutors, overruled Ivashov's efforts to thwart that agreement. But Ivashov did not give up, nor did some of his superiors in Moscow. The result was an episode that a number of us here this morning remember vividly. Toria, Madeline, certainly, if she weren't at the board meeting, Sandy, Jim, and two of our most important colleagues from across the Atlantic, Javier and Wolfgang. But I'm going to zero in on this incident, not because we have a quorum for a reunion to reminisce about those couple of days. I'm doing so because it marked, to the best of my knowledge at least, Vladimir Putin's emergence as a visible figure in the backstory of the ism that now bears his name. So we're talking June 1999. A ceasefire is in effect, both on the ground and in the skies over Serbia. Tori and I made a trip to Moscow with an interagency delegation to put the finishing touches on the arrangement that Chernomyrdin had endorsed. While we were there, the deal started to come unraveled. We had 2 3-stars of our own from OSD and JCS, Doc Vogelsong and George Casey. And they held a separate meeting with Ivashov and the military. And Ivashov used that meeting to basically reassert the demand for an independent Russian sector while adding a threat that if NATO did not back down and give them a sector of their own, they would establish one unilaterally. Meanwhile, a Russian armored unit attached to the international peacekeeping force in Bosnia suddenly pulled up stakes and set off on a mad dash eastward, presumably towards Kosovo. I asked for an urgent meeting with President Yeltsin. I was told he was indisposed, and I knew what that meant. So we had to settle for a meeting with his relatively newly appointed National Security Advisor, Vladimir Putin. It was, at the time, and all the more in retrospect, a totally creepy encounter. His manner, which sticks with me to this day, was superficially cool, professional, and courteous. But the iciness and the controlled contempt were just under the surface. But that's tonal. The really interesting thing about it was substance. And what struck us most was the aplomb, the brazenness, and the smugness with which he lied. He had to know exactly what the military was up to. Yet he assured us categorically that the terms that Chernomyrdin had agreed to were still valid, that nothing untoward, as he put it, was going to happen to upset the hard-won peace and the deal that brought about that peace. Then when we told him about the threat that Ivashov had made to our own generals who were meeting just a couple of blocks away, Putin claimed gratuitously, and not to mention implausibly, that he had never heard of this Ivashov. It's a little bit like Sandy Berger saying that he never heard of George Casey in the midst of the single most important piece of diplomacy going on at that time. Anyway, within hours, the Russian unit of about 250 troops was setting up a base camp at the Pristina airport. Our own delegation ended up setting up a kind of base camp of our own, although we didn't get to sleep, in the bowels of the defense ministry. We pulled an all-nighter there, trying to defuse the crisis. Those talks were very, very tough, but they were tame compared to the knockdown, drag-out shouting match that we both witnessed with our eyes and could hear down the corridor. It was almost as though our hosts were throwing furniture at each other among the Russians. On one side were the defense minister, Marshal Igor Sergeyev, and the foreign minister, Igor Ivanov. Squared off against them was the chief of the general staff, Anatoly Kvashnin, who was clearly behind the Pristina end run and who was no doubt the person who had been issuing the orders to Ivashov to obstruct the Chernomyrdin mission. So to make a long and bizarre story short, Sergeyev ultimately prevailed over Kvashnin, but just barely, and not until Yeltsin reemerged from his indisposition to put the original deal back in place. Now, a word more about what I presume, guess, and strongly believe to be Putin's role in this. In his capacity as Presidential National Security Advisor, which is to say Sandy's counterpart in the Kremlin, Putin was either hedging his bets on how the Russian interagency dynamics would play out, which isn't managing the interagency very well, or he was actively throwing in his lot with Kvashnin and Ivashov, who in turn were defying their minister and their military superior officer, Sergeyev, not to mention their commander-in-chief, President Yeltsin. So jump ahead 8 weeks. Yeltsin stuns the world by promoting Putin to prime minister and designating and his designated successor, thus setting up Putin to be Bill Clinton's counterpart in the Kremlin. Now, during the short interregnum that followed, Putin did everything he could to burnish his law and order tough guy image, including identifying himself with Moscow's scorched earth conduct of the war in Chechnya. Chechnya, which a number of Russians told us at the time was Russia's Kosovo. However, with regard to relations with the outside world, Putin stuck with the soothing partnerstva line of Yeltsin. I saw him just before Christmas, 1999, which was a little more than a week before Yeltsin resigned and Putin became acting president. And I remember very clearly what he said. Russia belongs to the West. He wanted to show what he called my own people and the world that on the really big issues, we, Russia and the United States, are on the same side. He added that he had no use for those in his country who thought, and again, this is his words, isolation, retrenchment, and confrontation were an option for Russia. Now, while he conspicuously made no reference in that conversation to Yeltsin himself, who was still president of the country and his boss, at least he was affirming Yeltsin's basic orientation, which is no doubt what he was hoping I would report back to Washington, and I did. But I remember thinking at the time that this was the same guy who had assured our delegation a few months before that there was nothing to the reports that we were hearing about the Russian army breaking bad over and into Kosovo. So that's the backstory. Here we are 15 years later, living through the story itself, in which Putin is the protagonist and to an increasing degree our antagonist. He has made himself, particularly in his third term, the champion of precisely those in his country who have for a quarter of a century favored retrenchment in its domestic order. He's rolled back democratization and enfranchisement of the regions. He's muzzled and monopolized the media. He's come up with his own vocabulary for what are essentially reinstatements of the pillars of Soviet rule, managed democracy and the vertical of power. And in foreign policy, he's replaced partnership with competition. He scorned Russia's European vocation and embraced the Eurasian option. Putin's speech, this is, by the way, been going on for some years now. We're looking back to 2007, 7 years ago. He gave a speech in Munich that echoed very much what Pavlov and Khrushchev had used to accuse Gorbachev of letting foreigners run Russia's affairs and define its interests. And if you flash forward to this March, when Putin went before the parliament to assert Russia's right to annex territory in neighboring countries, it was a speech that almost channeled what Yeltsin's enemies, Rutskoy and Zhirinovsky, had been saying 20 years ago. It was essentially Putin's version of Kozyrev's April Fool's speech in Stockholm 21 years ago, only Putin isn't fooling. As for Glasnost, he's given way to disinformation of the sort used to avoid culpability for the downing of MH17, a big lie worthy of Mikhail Suslov, who I'm sure all of you remember as the Politburo chief of Agitprop. And speaking of names from the past, on ascending to the presidency, Putin kept General Kvashnin, despite what looked to me like something bordering on mutiny, as chief of the general staff for another 5 years. Kvashnin's subordinate in the Pristina gambit, General Ivashov, is today a member of Putin's informal brain trust and vice president of a recently formed Academy for Geopolitical Affairs. As for Yeltsin's principal tormentors, Rutskoy remains active in Russian politics. When Zyuganov celebrated his 65th birthday, Putin attended and presented him with a first Soviet copy of the Communist Manifesto. And Zhirinovsky, while marginalized, has had a bit of a comeback as a supporter of separatists in eastern Ukraine. The point here is that while Putin was a relative latecomer to the ranks of those determined to restore much of the old regime, he became their enabler. He made it possible for them to succeed in recent years where they had failed before. Now, how much of the phenomenon that goes under the name of Putinism, which is obviously a personal description of the phenomenon, is really about Putin? And this, I suspect, will be an issue that we will discuss and debate in the days to come. And there was even some discussion of it last night at the terrific panel of the three secretaries and Nick. My own view is it is a lot about Putin. It is personal. I accept that there's a strong case that there would have been a degree of backlash and backsliding simply because Gorbachev and Yeltsin were so unpopular at the end of their terms, and also given external developments that have roiled up the political elite in Russia since then. And I'm thinking here of the U.S. withdrawal from the ABM Treaty in 2002, the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, the second tranche of NATO enlargement in 2004, the colored revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine, the formal independence of Kosovo, which didn't come until 2008, and in 2012, the double whammy of the Magnitsky Act and NATO's overthrow of the Gaddafi regime in Libya. Those and other episodes would have complicated U.S.-Russian relations, no matter who was in the Kremlin. Stayed on a course, despite serious turbulence. The trust between Gorbachev and Reagan survived the Strategic Defense Initiative. Gorbachev and Bush 41 weathered the strains of the first Gulf War, and the Bill-Boris bond held tight through the first tranche of NATO enlargement and the Kosovo War. In those cases, the state-to-state relationship was highly personalized, and that's in part because of something that is deeply seated in no matter who's in the Kremlin, whether it's a czar, a general secretary, he wields immense personal and not just bureaucratic power. He presides over what Dick Pipes called a patrimonial state, and it still has that aspect to it. There has always been a vertical of power. There was a vertical of power even when the reformers were in place. And that's one reason why who ends up in the Kremlin really matters, and why the story of succession is so important to the phenomenon that we are studying. The sequence of Kremlin leaders over the last 25 years is an extraordinary story in itself. It's packed with melodrama, irony, suspense, farce, plot twists, and of course, tragedy. It's worthy of a Mussorgsky opera. Act 1 opens in March 1985 when the Politburo convenes to choose a successor to Chernenko, which invites another counterfactual. I think Ernie May would permit this one. If any of the other 4 or 5 candidates to succeed Chernenko had gotten that job, we might very well today, 29 years later, still have a Soviet Union, a Warsaw Pact, and a Cold War. Once Gorbachev was in the Kremlin, he had the power to force change in the face of massive opposition. He elevated Yeltsin to help him to do so, and then cast Yeltsin into the political wilderness, which brings us to Act 2. Yeltsin fights back and replaces Gorbachev, yet adheres to the key features of Gorbachev's own reforms. But Yeltsin, too, has the trump card of inhabiting the Kremlin, and he knows it. Despite his late-blooming credentials as a Democrat, he was very partial to a particular Russian verb, tsarstvovats, to rule as a czar, and he particularly liked using it in the first-person singular, especially when he asserted his power against the opposition. But this is where the opera turns tragic. This democratizing czar plucks out of obscurity a junior operative and anoints him as his heir. And he does so for reasons that I can only describe as grotesquely irresponsible and ignoble and selfish, namely to protect the Yeltsin family's physical and financial security. In Act 3, Putin is as good as his word on that personal commitment, but in just about every other respect, he shreds Yeltsin's political legacy. Putin becomes himself the anti-Yeltsin and, by extension, the anti-Gorbachev as well, thereby earning the support of those forces and constituencies that had tried unsuccessfully to thwart Putin's 2 immediate predecessors. Moreover, Putin's policies reflect to a degree a widespread public mood that includes nostalgia for Russia's geopolitical heyday and disillusionment with the downside of reform. Taking all that into account, it's understandable that many commentators believe that Putinism will be with us for a long, long time, perhaps much longer than Putin himself. Okay, now we're into a zone where Ernie May doesn't want us to go, which is prophecy, but I'm going to take a stab at it anyway with apologies to him. I would bet for 2 reasons that that is not going to be the case, that Putinism is not going to last that long. The first reason is what is new about Putinism. and that is his conviction that the substitution for Marxism-Leninism as an ideology for Russia should be nationalism, Great Russian chauvinism, basing Russian statehood on ethnicity. He's used that in Ukraine to expand Russian territory, but the concept is a double-edged sword. It could shrink Russian territory. Vast parts of that vast country are populated by non-Russians, and a Russian chauvinist in the Kremlin who wears a crucifix around his neck, which is on display every time he takes his shirt off, may be hastening the day when the Caucasus and Central Asia will be even more vulnerable to jihadists and those who have dreams of a Caucasus caliphate in the south. Now, the other reason to doubt Putinism's longevity is what's old about it. The essence of Putinism is the essence of the regime that failed in the 20th century. It failed to modernize the Russian economy. It failed to normalize society. It failed to integrate Russia into the international community, as what Bob Zellick has called in a different context, but it's a good phrase, a responsible stakeholder. And that failure explains, looking backwards, why the Soviet system and Soviet state lasted how long? 7 decades, 70 years, the biblical span of a single mortal life. Moreover, that monstrosity was not, in the final analysis, killed by its external enemies, like those that Lieutenant Colonel Putin hunted down in Dresden and those he still obsesses about, often with his paranoid imagination from the Kremlin. Rather, that monstrosity died because of its own pathologies, its own unfitness for survival in the modern world. In short, precisely because Putinism is, as our topic says, redux, that is a conscious attempt to bring back from the past a model for Russia's future, it's doomed. But I want to end by making that same point a little bit more positively. Russia, thanks in no small measure to the surviving legacies of Gorbachev and Yeltsin, and also a legacy of the Reagan administration, the Bush 41 administration, the Clinton administration, and the Bush 43, got to get those numbers right, administration. Russia today is not the Soviet Union. It is not a monolith. It's bigger than Putinism. It's much bigger. It's also, despite the retrograde policies of its current leadership, more modern and more normal. So I would submit that the prescriptive challenge for us in the coming days is to brainstorm on how to punish, isolate, and contain Putinism while maintaining engagement with Russia as a whole. And Condi, I think that was the bottom line prescription that you suggested to us in the panel discussion last night. Or to put it in Bob Gates's terms, we have to find a way of containing and dealing with Putin without breaking Russia. But the real fact is Putin himself is, if he stays in power for too long, going to break Russia himself. Thanks, and I'm sorry that we didn't leave enough time to talk.